Hello, this is Dr. Hausinger, and this lecture is regarding supply control for illegal markets. It's definitely a flashback to a previous chapter that we had that described markets. So here we have Mr. Mackey, drugs are bad, okay. All right, so let's start with some definitions. Supply control, a definition, is a set of interventions for targeting the production, distribution, and sale of illicit psychoactive substances. And sometimes this could also be the precursors to illicit psychoactive substances. For example, things like Sudafed or the specific type of opium poppies, um, coca leaves, etc. So remember that there are some things that are naturally occurring that are then turned into things that become illicit psychoactive substances. The premise of this is to decrease the supply, and that will decrease and limit drug consumption. Okay, so if we decrease the supply, then it won't be available. That's the idea behind it. The supply is the relationship between the price and the quality of drugs that producers and distributors are willing to provide at that price. So one of the things that we can look at is drug epidemics occur every 20 to 25 years. Part of that might have to do a little bit with supply and prices going up. And a lot of that has to do with policy to restrict the precursor and the substances. So we see that now with opiates, right? But now we're, kind of forgot about it for a while. Methamphetamine is coming back up again. Okay. So when we're looking at supply, we're looking at the market relationship. Okay. The demand is the population's willingness to purchase drugs at a given price. And the consumption are the amount of drugs actually consumed. So a good example of this right now is that in certain states, as you know, marijuana is legal recreationally. And I'm thinking specifically of the state of Oregon, where they have millions of dollars worth of marijuana that they cannot move because now it's so widely available. The market is saturated, and you can buy an ounce for $60, depending on what it is. An ounce of marijuana for $60 instead of hundreds of dollars prior to its legalization. So that is an example of also how policy can change price and supply and demand based off of if something is legal or illegal. Okay. So now that marijuana is legal, there's more people producing it, and prices have gone drastically, but now there's a surplus. The role of law enforcement in supply and demand does a couple different things. So one, they target to reduce the supply, such as the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency. They might arrest, prosecute, and incarcerate. They also burn drugs. So not too long ago in Texas, they were advertising for a government contractor who could burn hundreds of thousands of pounds of marijuana very quickly. And the background check on this was absolutely incredible. As you might imagine, they don't want people stealing the drugs for themselves. That would be diverting. Okay. Another example of this would be restrictions on precursor substances such as Sudafed. There's a great documentary, sometimes it's on Netflix, called The World's Most Dangerous Drug, which is about methamphetamine, and it came out in the probably before 2010, but closer to 2010. And it talked about how in the early 2000s, 1 in 4 people that were locked up in the downtown Portland, Oregon jail tested positive for methamphetamine. And one of the things that they did is they made it so that Sudafed had to be bought with a prescription. And 90% of the labs went away. But now we're seeing a different type of meth that is synthesized and manufactured in other countries and then already brought through. So it's eliminated the need for labs, okay, which is interesting. That's another response to policy. Okay. So community policing seeks to help to reduce the demand through arrests, but also through building relationships with law enforcement. Another thing that law enforcement does is to drive a wedge between the supply and the demand. So, for example, a buy bust stings going undercover, stopping the supply before it really hits the streets, etc. And then law enforcement seeks to reduce the harmfulness of drug use, such as decriminalization and case management. You're seeing more and more law enforcement and fire department agencies actually hiring social workers and mental health triage specialists in order to increase the community relationships that they have, but also to work with high risk individuals. So, one of the things that they were finding that happens with police and fire departments is that they have repeat callers. And sometimes that's because people are isolated and they get their socialization from the police department and from the fire department, which is adaptive in some ways, very creative, but also maladaptive and does take taxpayer resources in other ways. And so, in order to do that, to reduce that, but also not to alienate and isolate these people who are reaching out and using social services, but through the emergency services arena, is to appoint case managers to have working relationships with these individuals and families and to help get them services, but also to teach them skills. Another example is the LEAD program in Seattle, and some other police departments across the country have similar programs where if a person has a small amount of drugs on them, maybe enough for them to sell to somebody else to buy their own drugs or to fuel that habit, then instead of being arrested for that, they can enter a case management diversion program that will help them with homelessness, getting housing and food, etc. Right. So this is a flashback to a previous chapter that we had. So some of this is a little bit of a review. As we know, drugs are bought and sold in markets, both figuratively and literally a physical marketplace, and it could be a virtual marketplace. We talked about the Silk Road, but also, not in a literal sense, but a virtual sense. Okay. A kilo that is confiscated does not necessarily mean that 1 kilo is not consumed. What can happen is to prevent shipments from entering the country, reducing drugs available for domestic distribution, right? There might be decoy drugs, right, as a distraction that are sent somewhere while the main cargo is being sent somewhere else. Okay? Just recently in Philadelphia, they had a huge drug bust on the shipping ports where millions of dollars worth of cocaine were were seized. Okay? 333 pounds of cocaine seized in shipping container filled with beach chairs at the port of Baltimore. Okay? And they believed that it had a street value of $10 million. And the week prior, there was more than 16 tons of cocaine also in a ship that could be worth up to $1 billion, and that was seized in Philadelphia. So the first one was Maryland, Baltimore, and then this one was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Okay. They had 15,000 kilos of cocaine. Okay. So consumption responds to price. And this is an economic term, an elasticity on demand. So, for example, a 10% increase in price could lead to a 5% decline in demand. So, we're still seeing people being willing to pay for it, but some people might try to find a less expensive substance or make their own or try something different. Okay. Substitution means constraining the cost of one drug, making people turn to another drug, and that would be the substitute. So, for example, you may have heard that cocaine or methamphetamine is the poor man's cocaine. So, if cocaine prices are through the roof, somebody might turn to methamphetamine or they might try to make their own. Okay. Now, sometimes the consumption of both drugs decrease, which would be a complement. And then we see that the demand for cocaine, heroin, and marijuana is responsive to price changes. Right? And going back to our earlier example, now marijuana in Washington and Oregon and other states is very, very plentiful. Prices are down. They can't move it fast enough. So there's an opposite thing there. Right? Okay. So we have this supply disruption. There are a variety of natural things that can happen and man-made things that can happen. There could be a crop failure. This is kind of a silly story, but several years ago in Montana, the DEA got a tip that there was a farmer that was growing marijuana. And they showed up at this farm, and there were greenhouses full of plants. But they weren't marijuana plants. They were tomato plants. And the DEA showed up and destroyed somebody's tomato plants. Right? So sometimes things like that happen. But we can see things like tsunamis, monsoons, dry weather, droughts, or too much rain, etc., destroying crops, or other things like bugs, right, predators. Okay. Police busts can absolutely interrupt an anticipated supply. Physical shortages could occur for a variety of different reasons. Right? A police bust could be one of them. Banning precursor supplies. There's a lot of different things that could actually happen here, but then, of course, natural events. So these are unanticipated supply shocks. Right? So the example of those two ship container busts, that would be an example of something that was unanticipated. Okay. Every once in a while, too, you'll hear about the Coast Guard, and they have unearthed some bricks of drugs, usually cocaine, in the ocean that's attached to a poor sea turtle. Usually it's a turtle that somebody probably threw overboard because they were afraid of being captured. Then we have ongoing supply, where you have more of the policy aspect. So we have risks generated by detection efforts. Okay? So that could be ongoing TSA, border control, drug sniffing dogs. Think about policies, procedures, and things that are in place to detect drugs. Risks generated by other suppliers. So this could be cartel violence, gang violence, etc. And then risks of imprisonment. And then, of course, we have the mandatory minimum drug sentencing in some cases would be an example of this. Right. So here is a chart to help you look at the differences here. Okay. So we have different types of programs, and this would be who it's targeted, and then how the price is affected. So if we have a program that's geared towards the eradication, alternative development, refinery destruction, or precursor chemical control, then we're working on trying to nip it in the bud from growing, production, and refining. Okay. So this might be something like a government poisoning crops, precursor crops. Okay. And then, of course, the export price would be affected by that because you don't have a lot of product. Okay. Interdiction. This would target smuggling, so trying to get it right away or intercept it. Okay. And then we have the cost affected here. We're trying to import things minus the export. So this might be something that you might look at, border control. Investigation programs target high-level domestic trafficking, and then this affects the wholesale price minus import. Okay. And then we have street-level enforcement. So this would probably be, depending on how we would flip the pyramid here, this affects retailing. Okay. And then retail minus wholesale. Right. So some of you might remember my story. My father was a police officer in Connecticut in the 80s and 90s. And for a year or two, he actually served on an externship program with the state police on the narcotics squad. And what they would do is they would do the kind of 80s beat cop thing and try to do the street level enforcement. And they would do things like have undercover identities, establish relationships with drug dealers. He would sit in dumpsters and wait for people to go by. He had a little tape recorder. This is way before digital recorders that he had, and he would record the drug busts, and he would buy drugs from people and in-sting operations and things like that. Right. So here we have an example of supply enforcement programs target specific levels of the manufacturing and distribution chain. As we know earlier, there are several countries that have most of the cocaine, and that would be Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia. And this was in the news last year, 2018, 2017, about offering aid to different countries that are known for trafficking in cocaine. And actually, one of the policies is that we give countries money for resources so that they don't resort to using drug trafficking for income. Okay. And as you know, 90% of the world's heroin comes from Afghanistan, because I have the ideal climate for growing poppies. And then we have Burma there as well. Okay. Factors affecting concentration of production. So it's not a coincidence that we have cocaine and opiates coming from countries where there's a lot of war. Things like corruption, cultures of institutional failure, oligarchies, dictatorships, acceptability of illicit wealth. So think about Scarface. Political events, upheaval, and then weak authority of the central government, particularly in countries where there might be large cartels or crime families that run the government, or have people appointed, or it's corrupt. So that is not a conspiracy. Okay. How is production limited? Crop eradication, that would be getting rid of the crops, especially precursor substances, to limit, reduce, and destroy crops through aerial or ground spraying. Alternative development, which would be providing incentives to farmers to grow other crops. So this could be something that is financial or other programs, but usually it's financial. Precursor control would be limiting ingredients like Sudafed. In the early 2000s in Lewis County, Washington, and other counties in Washington, where meth was a big problem, where manufacturing meth was a big problem, they had a program called Meth Watch, where store owners could have stickers, in their windows, and it meant that they participated in a community program with the police department, in which if you came into a store buying things and it didn't look like maybe you needed these items, or suspicious combinations of items, then you would be reported to the police. Another example of this is, I don't know how many of you have tried to buy Sudafed recently, but there's a limit. And when you buy something like that, you have to show your license to the cashier, and they actually type it in, and then it's in the system. I think the limit is like 4 boxes maybe. So let's say you go to Fred Meyer and you buy 4 boxes, and then you go to Walgreens and you try to buy 4 boxes. They're not going to allow you to do that. It's going to be flagged. So there's an example to that. Okay. And then there's in-country enforcement, which could be a direct attack on cartels or interceptions, right? Again, undercover police work, interstate police work, etc. And sometimes, unfortunately, the DEA might get it wrong and destroy your tomatoes. Okay. So the next few slides, we have some interesting pictures of drug smuggling, and there's some fascinating documentaries out there about it. So, and I would even say that maybe these numbers are underestimated. This is probably just what gets caught. 400 tons of heroin per year, 1,000 tons of cocaine. Um, we know that this year that's already been surpassed based off of what happened recently in the United States in Baltimore and Philadelphia with the huge shipment busts. Okay. Shipping containers or built-in items, and things can be hidden, right? So shipping containers, we know that human trafficking occurs in shipping containers. Certainly drugs, there's so many of them and there's so much in ports. So that's why you're going to see a lot of concentration of use in ports and borders from countries and states. Okay. So here we have a car. They've ripped off the seats. You can see the seat belts, and they made a compartment. Okay. Here we have somebody that has inserted drugs into their cavities. People also might swallow balloons with substances, and the risk of that, whether you're stuffing it or you are swallowing it, is if the balloon fails, you could overdose fairly immediately if it breaks. So here's some more pictures. So we have a tire stuffed with bags. This is a garden hose that's cut off. It was hollowed out inside. So they had actually wrapped the hose around a makeshift container here and then glued it on. Okay. This is a Mr. Potato Head filled with pills. This is a fish that was stuffed. This is a fire extinguisher that presumably that's probably cocaine, just because the amount of it, and then it would be ready to be diverted and cut into more cocaine, or cut and then cooked down into raw cocaine. Okay. And then we have, this looks like marijuana that wasn't packaged very well, or they might have cut it open while finding the tire. Okay. So if you're interested in that, there's other great pictures online too. So the high level of enforcement, one of the issues here is it's difficult to measure the outcomes. And again, whenever we have policy or we are reducing the supply, the demand is still there because the addiction is still there. So if we get rid of it, we still have people that are going to be trying to find different ways to get high. And an example of this would be crocodile, Krokidil, which is popular in parts of Russia. It is a mixture of codeine and diesel fuel. People may start to use it because it is cheaper than heroin. Imagine that, something that is cheaper than heroin, because heroin's really inexpensive comparatively if we're looking at other drugs. And you can cook it on your stove just like a person could cook, any drug. And people also have used it when heroin no longer works. Well, the problem with this is that it causes flesh-eating bacteria and gangrene. So if there's a restriction on heroin, and codeine is easier to get, and there's actually a huge issue with pharmacies and illegal pharmacies and corrupt pharmacies that are diverting codeine for the black market. And diesel fuel, you can get diesel fuel pretty much everywhere. So if we take away the heroin, which still is not great, let's not debate that, but then we get something that's even riskier. It's dirtier, and it's estimated that a person can only stay on it for about 3 years before their body completely rots away. And if you want to Google this or look at a documentary, you can. I'm just going to warn you that it's incredibly graphic because people's skin, muscles, tissue, everything literally melts off of their bone, and it's incredibly painful. And this is something that people inject. I'm not aware that it's taken any other way. Okay, so another way that things are a little bit difficult, investigations are costly and may take years. Think about if you're trying to establish a relationship with a cartel or a dealer, and that can take a really long time. Years and years and years. These people aren't stupid. Okay. And then, of course, corruption could happen along the way, etc., or deaths. High-level traffickers protect themselves via bribes. So we see that, again, in countries with weakened central governments and histories of corruption. Low-level dealers are easier to replace than high-level drug traffickers because, again, um, those are higher up levels. They've established themselves. They're very smart. Low-level dealers are often dealing for their habits themselves. Okay. And then we do have that violence figures into retail enforcement. Okay. Not that there isn't violence on the higher level, but it's a lot different if you're shipping, $1 billion worth of cocaine, or if you are a low-level street dealer, right, who is not as protected, because they don't care. You could die, and then they'll get somebody else. Right? The other thing that can happen is sometimes we have cartels and drug trades being run from prison. So you'll have high-level gang members that have already been caught, and they're running the low-level gang members from the inside out. And then if those people die, they just replace them with other people. All right. So we have seen cocaine decrease in the U.S. From 2006 to 2009, cocaine prices increased by 40%, which is a lot. So remember that cocaine was relatively expensive to begin with, and you could make it into crack rock, right? But powdered cocaine is usually more expensive. And then you have an alternative, which is methamphetamine, which is easy to make and a lot less expensive. So one of the reasons for this is that there was a decrease in the Colombian coca available for the production, crackdown and increasing violence in Mexico. So think about the geography of going up north. And then increase in non-US demand for cocaine. Right? So again, every generation has its epidemic and every drug goes in and out of style. So at the time, early 2000s, we were seeing a lot more meth. Okay. And then another thing here would be a good example of a precursor chemical, a limit on essential chemicals to make cocaine. So this might be something that you'd be interested in looking at too. The process for making cocaine. There was actually recently a Gordon Ramsay video where somebody takes him into the jungle where somebody is making cocaine and he witnesses it firsthand. Okay. So looking at sentences, we have arrests, which can lead to convictions and then incarcerations. We do have to remember that the people that, use substances are often not the people that are being arrested for substances proportionally. We have laws, punishments, and sentences that vary drastically worldwide. So we've been looking a lot at Portugal this semester, and that is an example of that. The Philippines, the current president wants to punish people by death for selling drugs and potentially using drugs as well. We saw something similar in Taiwan in the early 2000s as well. And then there's the debate, death sentences for drug offenders. One of the things that's been happening recently too is contention between China and the Canadian government. A Canadian citizen was arrested for smuggling methamphetamine into China, and they want him to have the death penalty. And that was largely in response to a high-profile Chinese diplomat ambassador being arrested and held. Okay, so sometimes we are seeing retaliatory policies. So challenges in supply control. Substances change. Dr. Z is a scientist who likes to make different legal highs. He invented mephedrine, but then it was taken from him and not copywritten, so he missed out on millions of dollars. But he's a very controversial person, and he tests all of his drugs on himself. And so one of the things that happens if we look at things like bath salts and spices is that the ingredients and things can change as substances or parts of substances, especially the synthetic substances, become illegal. Maybe one ingredient becomes difficult to track down. They can easily change it. Right. There are collateral consequences. Right. think about the micro, meso, macro level of that. So the individual, the community, and the policy. Right. Usually we have a trickle down versus trickle up. So if you think about, we have the farmers and the producers, and then we have the high level traffickers, and then at the very, very bottom are the street dealers all over the world, right? Street dealers being murdered and arrested and taken out of the street does not affect the production, and it does not affect the high level traffickers. Okay? They're disposable. Right? Racism absolutely plays a part in this. Okay? What substances are available, what substances aren't available, who gets arrested for what substances, etc. Knowing where to spend the money. Right? And different places, drugs are going to be different prices. And then it's difficult to look at how do we measure the success of our programs, because by the time that we have a policy, then we might have another problem, or a policy could actually create another problem, potentially a more serious problem.